Morning. Sorry, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Everyone's just logging in online, so we'll start really soon.
Yeah, good afternoon, folks. We'll get underway. I'd see there's a few people joining still, but yeah, thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name's Sean McCracken. I'm a river engineer based at Environment Canterbury here in Christchurch, and I'll be the MC for the day. And we've got Christian here to speak with us. So the webinar and this series of webinars is sponsored by the Regional Council River Managers Special Interest Group and Te Uru Kahika and Kanoa. Before we start, I'll just remind you that we've got a couple more webinars coming up through March. You can check out the details of these on the Resilient Rivers website, which Rachel put a link up to. But 3 more in March, and broadly, the theme that we've been going for with these next 3 is integrating some Western science research and sharing some of the research that's going on at the moment with some Indigenous knowledge as well, and sort of bringing those 2 together. So today's topic with Christian is focusing on climate change and the interaction between I guess increased rainfall and river flows through climate change. So Christian's just going to take us through some of the work that he's been doing as part of the Deep South Climate Change Impacts Project. Quick introduction for Christian. He's been at NIWA for over a decade, a hydrologist specialising in hydrological processes, implementation of hydraulic models in both gauged and ungauged catchments. So I think this is really, hugely relevant to a lot of us in the industry at the moment. I know I'm getting questions from community members, councillors, and alike, saying, well, so if the climate's changing, what's it going to mean for our flood scheme? And so this work that through the National Science Challenge is super relevant to answering those for us. I'll hand over to you now, Christian. You can run us through. If you've got questions for Christian, please add them into the Q&A box. If you like other people's questions that have already been put in there, please upvote them, and I'll ask those first at the end. And feel free to show some love for Christian with some of the reactions and emojis as we're going through. Thanks very much. I'll pass over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the work of a large team of people that have contributing to this pool of knowledge. The first one being Daniel Collins, who is now at Putau Research, but there has been a large number of people associated in a climate change generation project, data analysis, and ecological people that help us to make sense of what we found. Right. So today, I thought that instead of giving you a lecture about numbers, I was going to use a theme of example as a way to draw some knowledge about limitation, things that you can do, things that you can't do, things that you could be doing, and and potentially give you some idea of a pothole that we found ourselves when we started the project. The first component is going to be a brief I'm on mute. Sorry, am I on mute?
We can hear you just fine, Christian. Carry on.
Okay, sorry. So the first topic is going to be the hydrological projection. The Deep South Challenge has provided a link to an information sheet that summarize those information in much more detail than what I'm going to do. I'm just going to give you some the main findings. Then briefly talk about some different example of use, and that's going to be the core and the nuts of what I'm going to talk about. I'm briefly going to talk about CMIP6, so the next set of information, what is going to be different compared to the CMIP5, and then after summarize the information. So the main finding from the hydrological projection is, first one is, as a warning, it's a national scale assessment. It's focusing on natural regime and it's using consistent data set across New Zealand in order to drive hydrological process and hydrological process modeling. The first point is that climate change will impact hydrological regime differently across New Zealand, depending on the level of warming scenarios that is encapsulated into the representation concentration pathway acronym and across time. Example of result that you can have under RCP 8.5 for the late century, and I hope you can see my mouse, is on the left-hand side, you have the change in the extreme rainfall, which is represented at the 99th percentile of the daily rainfall, change in the mean annual flood, and you can see that the change in the mean annual flood roughly match the change in the extreme rainfall, the change in seasonal winter flow and summer flow, and by comparing the change in mean annual flood, change in mean winter flow, and change in mean summer flow, you can already see a number of things which are happening visually at regional scale, and a change in ecological stress if you use the metric of the 7-day MALF ecological stress as a function of 7-day MALF as a function of ecological stress. On those graphs, you have everything which is in gray is statistically not significant, which means that the difference that we are seeing between the past and the future is within the range of variation of what we are expecting to see under the natural climate variability. And you have things which are quite interesting happening, such as no change in mean summer flow, for example, in the Northland or Auckland region, but a large decrease in 7-day MALF. So it's not because you are going to have no change in the summer flow that your 7-day MALF is not going to answer. The other thing that we know is that the change are significant across the North Island around the mid-century, whereas they will start to be significant in the South Island at the end of the century. Everything is depending on the hydrological characteristic, but basically the North Island is starting to be statistically different from the past by mid-century compared to the South Island. In terms of the take-home message that I'm not going to talk about now, but it's going to be presented after, within the climate projection, which are in the NZ projection, climate change projection that are available through MFE, extreme events are not well represented to not represented at all. And I will discuss this a bit later. One thing that I found that is quite difficult for end user to understand is your historical past is not the observed past. It's a past that is statistically similar, but it's not the observed. And that introduced some difficulty of understanding and communication of what those projections can do. What we found through different applications is that the period 2006-2022 that I tend to call the near future real observation tend to sit within the climate model uncertainty across the different scenarios over that period. I didn't put 2023 because 2023 was really affected by extreme event, and we go back to the first point where extreme events are not really represented in a climate projection. The national hydrological projection and analysis are available through the DeepSouth knowledge broker, especially Kate Turner, who I believe is on the call. And they are available for free. There could be some extraction fees, but it's available for you to use. Based on our experience, those national hydrological projections are better suited for analysis at daily time step, weekly time step, or monthly time step, simply because climate projections which are provided to us are at daily time step. They are better used to provide information in terms of direction of the change rather than the absolute value of the change. And they are great to provide analysis at sub-regional scale rather than reach specific. The reason being is that the climate model are bias corrected at a scale of 29 kilometers, and then after spatially disaggregate to a scale of 5 kilometers. So you have a better handle of what the climate is at a scale of 25 kilometers rather than the nitty-gritty of the hill and valley across the landscape. When we talk about the use of those regional scale simulation, there is a couple of things that people have to remember. First is that those analyses are based on a change in magnitude between the reference period and the future period. And those change assume stationarity over each of the period. And you can use them to identify a consistent or inconsistent regional pattern into your simulation. So for example, here we are in Otago, we are looking at the change in the mean flow by the end of the century between RCP 4.5 on the left and 8.5 on the right. And you can wonder, well, the blue that you have here, which is a positive change, so an increase in the mean flow, if really it's representative of something which is happening across the climate, or if other artifacts which are happening within the model or within the downscaling of the information. You can use them to do some intercomparison between different hydrological characteristics. So here at the top, you have the mean flow. And now I'm bringing the change in the 7-day MALF that we use as to represent change in ecological stress. And you can see that you can see different patterns happening between the mean flow and the 7-day MALF. Especially what we are looking for is, do you see in the area where you have what I call a vertical shift in the hydrological regime? So you can imagine your flow duration curve shifting up or shifting down. So for example, in those two areas, you have a positive change between the mean flow and the 7-day MALF, which tell you that things are moving up. Or if you can see identify area in terms of a shift in the distribution of the hydrological regime. And here, for example, it's two other areas where the mean flow is going up, where the 7-day MALF is going down. So instead of having a vertical shift, you have a vertical shift and a tilting happening, which is going to change your hydrological regime. For information, the change that you have here in terms of the reduction in 7-day MALF by the end of the century in those areas is due to the fact that you have a shift from snow to rainfall dominated information. And because of a reduction in snowmelt contribution during the summertime, you have a larger deficit compared to the historical period. and why it's showing so well in red. One thing that you have to be aware is that the spatial pattern in regard of the change in volume is different than the spatial pattern in terms of the percentage change. So if you're looking at your maps in terms of volume or in terms of percentage change, you will have a total different spatial pattern. So please be careful when how you want to use information and what you are looking for. That's the reference to the report where this information was presented. Now, let's talk about one of the elephant in the room. Do you need to calibrate hydrological model to be used as part of climate change analysis? Well, the answer is depending on what do you want out from those hydrological projections. You have to remember that the climate models are free running, which means that the climate data, the historical climate data do not assimilate observation during the historical period, which means that for when you use it within a hydrological model, we found that the calibration of the hydrological model on observed climate usually fail when you use them with the CMIP5 historical realization because of timing of events which are not happening between the climate and the hydrology. And I'm going to try to illustrate into one example. So as part of a project, we run a hydrological model and validate those results using the operational VCSN. And the target that we had is that we wanted to have a hydrological model that was as precise as possible in the low flow to mid-range flow, because people were looking at irrigation demand after. So we went and calibrate our hydrological model. We look at a number of hydrological characteristics. We compare observation and simulation. We look at eco-hydrological characteristics. We look at statistical criteria, and well, everything was acceptable. It's not perfect, but that's acceptable. And so we replaced the VCS and climate by the CMIP5 and historical climate. So, and here we are looking at what does this mean in terms of average daily daily discharge. The blue line is the observed stream flow, the daily average observed stream flow at that location. The red line corresponds to the simulated with a VCSN. So it's not perfect, but you get your peak at the right time. You have the quite seasonal. Your low flow is well matching. You have some issue at some time of the year, but you know, it's not perfect. The model is not perfect. The orange line corresponds to the CMIP5 average. So across the 6 model that you have, the CMIP5 hydrological derived flow, driven flow. And you can see it's mushy. It's not that great. You have your low flow happening roughly at the same time, but it's really mushy. You can't match any of the peaks, so on and so forth. So you ask yourself some question is it an issue that you have with the hydrological model? But if you calibrate the model based and you get some really good result where you think that you will have a good set of parameters, or is it an issue with the climate data? And it's unfortunately, most of the time, it's an issue with the climate data and the fact that your climate simulation do not match your hydrological observation. So you have a number of mismatch happening. So you go to the next stage, which is, well, if we can't use a calibration, perhaps we should use a bias correction. If you do a bias correction, you tend to do a bias correction on hydrological characteristic, not time series. There is different techniques that you can use. There is basically 2 big methods, one being the quantile mapping family versus what I refer as a water balance family. The quantile mapping is trying to tweak the distribution of the hydrological characteristic that you are looking for by using the empirical cumulative distribution function. You can have some really great result on the observed time period. Unfortunately, it tends to generally reduce the potential variability that you have under future climate scenario, simply because you impose the variability that you had during the calibration of the quantile mapping correction to the future simulation. The water balance approach is much more, I would say, a holistic approach, where you tend to bias correct a modeling chain rather than a model itself. And in order to reproduce a behavior. One thing too is one potential pitfall that you have with the quantile mapping is if you do a quantile mapping just based on hydrology, you may generate some inconsistent response compared to the climate data that you are using. So if you do a quantile mapping, you need to do a quantile mapping over everything rather than just the hydrology, whereas the water balance just look at the hydrology aspect. The national projections that I presented earlier are bias corrected towards the mean flow, and it's a similar process than the one that is described in the Woods et al. Paper in 2006, and it's using a water balance approach. And the specification, the particular point associated with the bias correction that was done at the time was that all the error was put on the precipitation, not on any other climate variable. And yes, when we look to and we compare the mean flow observation, simulation over the mean flow observation over a set of natural stream flow station, we have a really good correlation at low flow and high flow. However, it's not working very well on the low flow, but it's not worse than what we had if we were looking just at a VCSN-driven simulation. So using the climate change projection instead of the VCSN doesn't increase the underlying uncertainty that you have with the hydrological model. So there is some consistency, which means that if you are just looking at the change, you can look at those as an uncalibrated model or a bias corrected model rather than trying to calibrate the model. What we found when we apply those type of bias correction on hydrological regime is if you follow a water balance approach, you need to do a GCM specific bias correction because each GCM have their own physics and their own interaction with the orography across New Zealand. And in order to do this, you really have to consider cryosphere as one of the criteria that you need to bias correct to. It's really important. It's representing a combination of rainfall and temperature, and it's affecting a lot of low flow simulation or representation, especially in the South Island or in snow-affected catchment. And that gives you a bias correction of the volume as well as the distribution of the flow. And here an example is on the left-hand side, the red corresponds to the observed cumulative discharge and the flow duration curve. And each of the acronym or the color correspond a different climate model, which is used in the climate on the CME5 climate projection. And that's without any bias correction, a GCM specific. Now, if you do the same, the bias correction on the GCM and you include some cryospheric correction, you have a representation of the flow duration curve that is better than previously, and you reduce the underestimation in terms of the volume of discharge produced by your model. So you're getting towards something that is much more usable for some of the questions that you want to answer. If you go to now, there is two types of use that we are asked for. One is about low flow, and that's usually associated with water consenting, or one about high flow, which are associated with flood design. If you look at water consenting and you want to look at climate change impact on low flow characteristic, for example, magnitude and duration, to support a water consent application and you want to look if it's going to be okay into the future at different time period. I'm not going to talk about the national scale one that we described earlier, but if you look at a location specific, it's possible to develop a GCM specific bias correction based on hydrological characteristic, looking at low flow and mid-range flow at the same time. And here I'm going to give you an example where on the blue, you have the different climate models that have been generated. The simulated correspond to the bias corrected GCM specific characterization or hydrological characteristic. And here you have a certain number of hydrological characteristics. So the mean annual precipitation, the mean annual runoff, the 7-day MALF, the snow cover duration. So the precipitation and the runoff were calculated from the NZ river maps, which is a national data set produced by Whitehead and Booker from 2019, and which is available on the net that you can download. And by adding by inverting the mean runoff, you can, and adding annual average evapotranspiration, ignoring any change in a groundwater system or any change in the snow storage, you can generate a new representation of what the precipitation could have been. And you can do some bias correction associated with it that will generate the corresponding runoff, the mean annual runoff that you want to see. So the targeted is what you reconstruct from hydrological characteristic, national hydrological characteristic, or from observation. So in that case, we were given a 7-day MALF by the client, and we were able to reproduce that 7-day MALF as well as a mean flow. The snow cover duration is derived from remote sensing snow cover area analysis, and we can see that we can represent a large number of those characteristics at the same time. It doesn't mean that from a time matching point of view, the simulation will be perfect, and you have to make the assumption that whatever hydrological model you use is giving you the correct timing of event, but statistically, it has all the ingredients that you are looking for. If you've moved out on the other side, on the flood and extreme, and for example, you want to look at trying to answer a question about what are the climate change impact on flood level. Here, I'm talking only about magnitude, because you want to do a new investment strategy as part of your long-term plan, or you need to design new flood banks or stream bank. If you look at the methodology, it's a sort of a open-ended question. There is not a unique methodology that is recommended in the literature, so it's still open-ended. And you have basically two different types of methodology. You have what I call the IPCC methodology, where you calculate your flood magnitude over a reference period under past and future condition, and you look at the difference in that flood magnitude. Or you have what I call the regional council methodology, and that's not pejorative here. It's you are using your flood magnitude using all the data available at the time when you calculate it. And using those different methodology, you will have different answer. The other thing is, what do you really want to have information about? Is it having a change in magnitude for a certain event, or do you want to compare with the historical? So looking if the flood event that you have in the past is going to get worse or better. It's a different way where you have on how you approach those calculations. Do you want to have an analysis at annual time step? What's happening when you are starting to look at a seasonal time step and you have a shift of the season, which is happening at the climate change? What about the frequency of the event? Instead of just the magnitude, the number of events that are happening per year. Is it something that you want to have a look at? How do you characterize this? The big question of return period. How to characterize the return period associated with any event? Well, big elephant in a room. Another one is stationarity versus non-stationarity. We have the math. It's not that difficult. It's just that you have to throw out all the rule book out of the window in order to make it happen. Are we ready to do this? Under stationarity, one thing that you have to be really aware is you have a limitation in terms of not only the number of GCM, but the small or the relatively small length of the annual time series that you are playing with. Under an IPCC methodology, as described above, a 20-year annual time series gives you confidence. You have confidence in the calculation of the annual return period up to the 1 in 6 year. Using the regional council methodology, the longest length that you have is 94 years, which means that your confidence is up to 130 years, which is usually not what you are looking at. Even if you were integrating the information from the Hindcast time sequence, you will go only up to 140 years to have any kind of uncertainty associated with the return period calculation. So in terms of national analysis, what can you find? Well, if you look at the mean annual flood, which is the 1 in 2.33 years, so we're still within our annual our uncertainty constraint, you can see some pattern happening. And those patterns are different between mid-century and late century. Same thing, everything which is in gray means that the difference is significant compared to the climate variability. And you can see there is a lot of blue happening, but you still have some pocket of yellow happening, some pocket of orange, some weird thing that is happening here. And it's not because you are getting blue by mid-century that you will get blue by the end of the century. Sometimes it's not happening. How could you answer the big question that everyone is asking me, what's happening about the 1% AEP? Well, you can say, all right, let's go and put all the model all together and we can have a look. So you have 6 GCM that have 94 years of data. You put all of them together, you can potentially have a 1 in 100 year. You still have on the Hindcast the issue that you're just going to have a 1 in 30 years, but no. So you pull all of them together and you can get some inference about the change in the 1% AP across New Zealand by late century. And you can see there is some really funny things happening. You have some funny thing happening around here. Even under RCP 2.6 over a short distance, you will have change happening on one side, so a reduction of the 1% AP and an increase of the 1% AP. If you go under RCP 8.5, you can have a large positive change on one side and just do a couple of kilometers away, you have something, you go the other way around. So, you know, you have to be really cautious in the way you do this. Now, what about the alignment with Earth? Earth is telling you that the precipitation the rainfall depth is increasing by a certain percentage per degree change across all duration. How do you reconcile a figure like you have on the right-hand side with the increase in the rainfall depth all over the country? You need, unfortunately, in order to do this, you need other tools. Another tool that, one of those tools that has been funded by the Deep South is the weather atom. The weather atom is a numerical experiment that was initially funded by Oxford to look at generating large ensemble atmospheric run under different warming scenarios. And other people are better placed than myself to talk about it. But instead of having a small number of members, you can generate annual time series of up to 3,000 years, which make the analysis of extreme event, which is much more realistic and much more accurate, as accurate as a model can be. Now, if you look at what's happening on the right-hand side and what's happening on the left-hand side, and you're trying to link both of them, one of the questions that you have is that the change in the mean annual flood doesn't translate into a change in lower frequency event, which means that your change for different frequency is going to be different, which means that the parametrization associated with flood frequency analysis is going to be different. And I'm going to let it sink because it has some huge implication in everything which has been designed and is continuing to be designed. Now, if you go to a location specific, and here I'm just going to give you a brief example of what does this mean from a visual perspective. Here we went in a specific location where we had a large watershed and that was draining to a specific riverine infrastructure, and we extracted the national annual time series for the national model, and then we did a flood frequency analysis. And on the right-hand side, you have the flood frequency analysis from each of the GCM, each of the climate model, based on a 20-year annual time series, going from a 1 in 2 to a 1 in 200 year event, because that was the information that we were asking. And you can see the range of variation that you have between GCM. You can basically run, I don't know how many trucks on each side, but it's absolutely huge. Why this is happening? Well, that's the reason why. So on the black-hand side here, you have two GCM, the AGM2 GCM and the NOR-ESM GCM, 2 of the 6 GCM. The black color corresponds to the annual time series generated using this specific GCM over the period 86-2005, and the plots that you have in a different color correspond to different RCP. So green is RCP 2.6, yellow 4.5, 4.5, orange is 6, and red is 8.5. And you can see how things are changing for each GCM on a year-to-year basis. You don't have the same timing of the event. You have some events that are really, I would say, I'm not going to say wrong, but spurious compared to the other GCM. You can see that under the NOR-ESM model, the annual time series, the discharge is increasing with the warming and with the time, whereas that's not really the case under the AGM2 model. So you have a large variability happening that you are trying to resume into a unique curve that you can use as a river engineer to drive your analysis. as I said, GCM uncertainty. The only thing that is different here is the climate model and the climate data, and both are realistic, both are representing past climate condition across New Zealand, across an ensemble of 52 metrics. So it's just telling you how things are variable and how things may play a part. Translating in number, if you look and you calculate the 1% AP using either the IPCC or the regional Cansin method, on the uncast period, you have the same 1% AP discharge. And you can see the variation that you have depending of the method and depending of the time period that you are using. So remember that the regional council by the period 2030-2049, using all the information from 1972 to 2049. So you still have 300 cumecs of difference, and these 300 cumecs will make quite a large, can be translated to quite a large amount of dollar in terms of flood protection. So if you want to use those climate simulation to drive flood or extreme event analysis, the control of the uncertainty is absolutely critical. You need to get a handle of your uncertainty, and you cannot do this without doing a bias correction. Calibration of your model is not going to be possible, and it's never going to produce anything that is reliable or physically meaningful because of the issue of timing of event. There is nothing we can do. It's how the climate data is given to us, and that's how we have to do. And you're likely going to have to use other tools to be able to answer those questions. Let's talk about the CMIP6. So what's coming up next? We have a new workhorse into our tool now. Previously, with the CMIP5, that's something I haven't discussed up to now, but I briefly mentioned that the bias correction and the downscaling was going to be done at was done at 30 kilometers. Now with the CCAM model, which has been developed by our colleague in Australia, we are using a sketch grid, which means that we have a resolution of around 12 kilometers across New Zealand, going up to over 100 kilometers far away from New Zealand. This gives us a highest confidence that we can resolve storm, such as atmospheric river or tropical cyclone, before they enter the New Zealand domain, and we will be able to represent and simulate their impact on the weather, as well as the climate, as well as hydrology and downstream impact. What is going to be different from you is you have the same number of GCM. The model resolution is different. So you go from a 30 kilometer with a CMIP5 downscale to a 5 kilometer to directly to a 12 kilometer under the CMIP6, directly downscale and bias corrected to a 5 kilometer grid. It is going to be open. So MFE will have all the climate simulation, and you will be able to go and download those climate simulation to do your analysis yourself. The information will be provided at daily time step for the same variable that were generated as part of the CMIP5. In terms of the documentation, there was a MFE guidance manual that was generated in 2018, and the DeepSAS graciously funded the hydrological projection. There is not going to be an update of the guidance manual document. There is going to be a document as well as a best practice document. And currently, hydrological projections are not funded by the DeepSAS, because DeepSAS stop at the end of June, or neither by MFE or MB. So in summary, your national national hydrological projection. Climate change impact will affect hydrological regime across New Zealand in a different way across warming and time. Your spatial pattern between the change in magnitude and the change in percentage change will be different. So please be aware of what you are asking for and how you are going to use this information. The change in the North Island are going to be statistically different from the climate variability around 2040 onward, whereas the South Island is the end of the century. The regional scale simulation can be used to identify spatial pattern of change in flow regime, and you can look at different flow regime, assuming that your flow regime is represented by hydrological characteristic. Bias correction versus calibration is depending of what you want to do, but usually calibration would be extremely difficult, extremely expensive, and may lead to unrealistic set of parameters. If you want to use those climate simulation as for water consenting, you can do this at local scale. You can bias correct the hydrological characteristic of your liking and your choosing. The big constraint being that the timing is still delivered by your hydrological model. You still need to trust the timing of the hydrological model. That's not something that can be controlled. If you are looking at flood design, basically, if you are looking everything under a 1 in 30 years, yes, you can use it. For everything which is above a 1 in 30 years, my recommendation would be to use other tools that have lower uncertainty in order that you can get some answer to what you want. That's my contact detail. Please get back to me if you have any question or if you want to raise any point, as well as my mobile and my landline. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christian. That was a brilliant presentation and just so much detail in there, and so much, I'm sure, for many of us to reflect on and unpick and to apply to how it fits our situation. I'll start things off, and I see that, excuse me, see there are a couple of questions coming in. But I wondered if you could, if you either know or maybe you could speculate. You highlighted a couple of times the difference between the North and South Islands and the timing at which those effects might be felt. Do you know, are you able to speculate on why that is? Is that an impact of, say, tropical cyclones, for example, you know, the different weather patterns that impact the two islands, or, yeah?
It's a combination of impact of weather pattern. So your weather pattern are shifting by 400 kilometers southeast under RCP 8.5 by the end of the century. So just to give you an idea, the weather pattern previously experienced in Hastings are likely to be the weather pattern experienced in Christchurch under RCP 8.5 by the end of the century. The other thing that you have playing in the South Island is the snow and the alpine. A lot of change that we are not seeing in the South Island, but we are seeing in the North Island, is because of this snow blanket that is still going to be here up to the end of the century. Glaciers are going to melt, but seasonal snow is still going to happen. And seasonal snow is still going to provide melt to sustain low flow during summertime. Less at glacier, but still going to be there. Increase in flood and winter flow are linked to the fact that you have a shift from snow-dominated to rainfall-dominated pattern in the South Island. So you have more rainfall coming in winter, so more discharge happening in winter at a time where soil is saturated, so likelihood of increase of flood.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. And yeah, good answer. Thanks. And interesting correlation relating the Hawke's Bay to Christchurch. Thanks for that for us Christchurch residents. Hey, I'll jump to a question from Mark. Relates to your guidance where you were saying for the infrequent events, events with a return period in excess of a 1 in 30-year event. So Mark says, I see people are using Herd's version 4 rainfall adjustment factors to estimated flood flows for rivers. What are your thoughts on using this approach?
It's tricky. When you are using Earth, you basically make a choice that the rainfall will immediately generate a flood, which is not happening in a large number of time. It's not because it's raining a lot that you will have a flood, or it's not, you can have a flood which is due to the fact that your soil is getting slowly saturated up to a point where you have a small rainfall event compared to everything else that has fallen, and suddenly everything is going and is released. In alpine catchment, the other component that Earth does not take into account is the snow melt. And if you have more atmospheric river happening at a time where you had a large snowpack or large rainfall that fell before and suddenly you have a large snowpack and a moderate rainfall event happening and a big warm temperature coming, Earth is not going to be able to represent this. The example, if you take the Wayo Bridge, we estimate that 50% of the flow that destroyed the Wayo Bridge came from snowmelt. Yeah. So you may over-design, you may under-design depending of the contribution that you are missing. It's not a simple, there is not a simple answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, good answer, Christian. And I guess if I were to paraphrase that, you're really highlighting the difference between rainfall and runoff, and so we can use a historic runoff or river flow record as one predictor of what future flows may be, or we could use a historical and predicted rainfall scenario. And we've got to be really careful and use some judgment in a site-specific basis when doing that. So,
yeah, I've seen some example where the largest change in the flood magnitude was under RCP 8.5. Oh, sorry, RCP 2.6. The largest change in magnitude. However, at the same location, I saw a catchment being in flood every 2 weeks under RCP 8.5 by the end of the century. So the frequency has to be considered too as part of the design. And will our system be able to cope with it?
Cool. Okay, I think I've got 2 more questions here. I'll start with what I think is probably the easier one, or the quicker one to answer, just regarding the Weather at Home resource. Could you just expand a little bit more on that? Neil was highlighting you did a quick Google search and didn't show anything, so maybe just expand on.
To find information about Weather at Home, you have to look at climateprediction.net. So it's a numerical experiment which has been initiated by Oxford, which is using distributed computing made available by user. And basically you download a version of atmospheric model that you run when you do nothing on your computer, and then the information is sent back to Oxford. And that's how you can, at a low cost, generate those thousands of simulations that enable you to generate such a large ensemble. There is some condition associated with it, is that in order to make those operations not so expensive for the end user, you have to relax the spatial resolution. So it's done at a spatial resolution of 25 or 50 kilometers, which is more precise than the GCM, which is between 100 and 500 kilometers. But still, at the scale of New Zealand, of a 50-kilometer resolution give you a poor understanding of the orographic effect. So you need to do some work after when you are using it, but at least you still have a number of simulations that can give you confidence in the uncertainty. And the point of contact for this would be Dr. Sue Rosier at NIWA. I think Kate can point to some resource on, there is an info sheet that has been done about Weather Atom 2 on the Deep South.
Awesome, thanks, Christian. In the interest of time, I'm going to wrap it up there. I do know there's 2 questions outstanding, and what we might do is invite Christian to respond to them after the webinar. But just to wrap it up on time, I'd just like to say thanks very much, Christian. That's been a really informative hour that you've spent with us. Really interesting to see and hear what you've been doing, where you're going with this research. As I said at the start, I think it's hugely relevant to a lot of us working in the industry. So thanks very much for your time, and thanks very much to everyone for listening and for the questions. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, everyone. Ka kite. See you.
Thank you.